great pleasure tonight is that I get the job of introducing our two speakers. So with all that ado, I can get to the business of tonight. The way the event's going to be set tonight is that we're going to really have a conversation between two Michigan authors that I'm going to introduce here. At the end, we're going to have a little bit of Q&A that I'll help to kind of wrangle here. But then our goal is to get all of you upstairs into the State Museum where there's going to be a reception, and both of our authors have agreed to sit and sign books and interact with you in more detail upstairs. So there will be more time for you to have that interaction following this. So getting to our two speakers, you all are probably familiar with Steve, and I'll talk about him second, but talking with him this evening is another Michigan author that you should be familiar with. Mardi Jo Link was born in Detroit, grew up in the state's southeastern suburbs, spending summers up north in Lake Michigan. She was the only daughter of educators, attended the Michigan State University School of Journalism, and she's worked as a reporter and writer both in the police and general assignment areas. She's been a magazine editor and a freelance writer. Her first book, When Evil Came to Good Heart, was published in 2008 by the University of Michigan Press and spent 4 months on the Heartland bestsellers list. Her second book, entitled Isadora's Secret, was published in 2009, also by the University of Michigan Press. It chronicles the mysterious disappearance of a Felician nun from a convent in 1907. So if you like historical material and crime, this is an author that you should be looking for. It's a very interesting work. That book was named to the Michigan Notable Book List. It was also a Great Lakes great read. There's a lot of different reads that we get involved in. And was also on the Heartland bestsellers list. Her latest work, if you haven't read it, is entitled Bootstrapped. It's a personal memoir. And if you have anybody who's ever lived on a farm or been through a divorce and raised kids on their own, I can highly recommend this book. It's a really good read. She now lives with her husband and 3 sons on a hobby farm up near Traverse City. Our featured speaker tonight is author Steve Luxenberg. Steve grew up in Detroit, where his book, Annie's Ghost, primarily takes place. Most of the events are in the Detroit area. He attended the Detroit Public Schools, including the Henry Ford High School. He's worked for 38 years in the journalism business as both a newspaper reporter and a newspaper editor. His first job was with the Baltimore Sun in 1974, and then he moved to the Washington Post in 1985 as deputy of the investigative staff. Some of you may know who he worked with at that time. He was the assistant managing editor, Bob Woodward. So Steve has had the pleasure of working with Bob through the years as well. He told some very funny stories off microphone about that. The group that he heads now has been responsible for all sorts of interesting investigative journalism. That group has won several major reporting awards, including 2 Pulitzer Prize awards as well. From 1996 to 2006, Steve was the editor of the Post Sunday Outlook section, which publishes original reporting and provocative commentary on a broad spectrum of political, historical, and cultural issues. You'll find if you engage him in conversation that his eclectic knowledge across the board is really quite amazing. His critically acclaimed book and our Great Michigan Read for this year is Annie's Ghost, A Journey into a Family Secret. If you have not read the book already, I won't reveal too many of the secrets, but the main secret is that the book revolves around his mother's decision to hide the existence of a sister, which is really the main secret of this book. His sister Annie was institutionalized at the Eloise Hospital near Detroit. Annie's Ghost was named to the Washington Post Best Book of 2009 list. It was honored as a 2010 Michigan Notable Book. It has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered, and he and his wife, Mary Jo Kirschman, now live in Baltimore, and they have 2 adult children. I hope that you will join me in welcoming Mardi Jo Link and Steve Luxenberg.
Society, but I just had the pleasure of reading Marty's Bootstrapped chronicle of living for a year on a Michigan farm, and it could be the great Michigan read, and maybe should be in the future.
Well, this is what happens when two writers get together. We have only met in person once before, and it was in this building. So it's great fun for me to see you again.
We're not going to do this anymore.
No, here we go.
No admiration. No, fire away the hard questions.
Well, I was initially struck by your ability to be a son, a journalist, and an author. And an author and a journalist are two different, I see those as two different voices or two different writers. And yet in the book you did it pretty seamlessly. But I can only imagine that you must have struggled with those things. So put us at your desk. What kinds of struggles did you go through in taking that journalist's eye and turning it on your own family?
You know, at no point in the researching and writing of this book could I forget that I was a son as well as a journalist. As much as I would have liked to have tried, I would like to have just been dispassionate. But as you know, writing is a craft, and it's not an accident. And so I had to make a decision. I had to say to myself, how do you tell this story in the best, most accessible way? I couldn't leave the emotions that I was feeling out of it, as much as I have been trained throughout my journalistic career to leave my emotions aside, because it was part of the story. There are some people who don't think that I should have written this book because it's dishonoring my mother. I don't agree with that, but I think it's important that when my mom was alive, it might have been her story. Mm-hmm. But when she died, it somewhat became my story. It didn't cease to become her story, but it became my story. And so, how do you tell that story? And if I had left out my own emotions, then it wouldn't have been my story. Then I would have been a historian. I would have been telling her story. So I think the best way to straddle that line was to adopt both personas in the book, and I try to do that. At some points, of course, it's hard. Like when my cousin Anna, I'm sorry she has the same name as Annie, confuses everybody. But when my cousin Anna, who I hadn't really met, she says I met her when I was about 2 years old, but of course I don't remember that. When she sits in a Detroit restaurant and unloads her anger at my mother from 50 years earlier, an argument they had had about The Secret, and Anna couldn't abide The Secret, and so they never talked again. And she's telling me things about my mother. Part of me is shouting, no, that's not the way my mother is. And part of me is saying, shut up and just let her talk. So that's the son and the journalist in the same conversation. And then when I went back and listened to the recording of the interview, I was furious at myself because I felt that I had not done a good job journalistically. I hadn't asked her the hard questions. Mm-hmm. I had bent over backwards, to use the cliche, trying not to intervene as the son. So it was difficult. And I think that once I was sitting at my desk, it was actually easier. Mm-hmm. Because at my desk, I'm really in the mode of being a writer. And
that felt natural to you.
Well, not natural, but I know it's a job.
Right.
And
it's familiar.
You have to craft, and you have to figure out, do I leave this out, do I put that in? I'm not thinking, oh, I'm feeling emotional right now. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I can't write, I'm feeling emotional right now.
Now you do take the reader in the book through your conversations with your siblings. So we know somewhat how this book dawned. But when did it cease to be a discovery and start to be a book?
Well, just for people who haven't read the book, how many people of you have read the book? All right, so I don't have to say too much here. But for those of you who haven't, my mother in 1995 is 78 years old. She is still working, still driving herself down the Lodge Expressway in Detroit to her job as a bookkeeper for a small company that sold gravestones. But she's going to the hospital with her emphysema attacks. And in the hospital, she mentions in a routine family history discussion with a doctor that she had this sister who went off to an institution when my mom was 4 and the sister was 2, and my mom has no idea what happened to her. Now, she doesn't say, by the way, doctor, I just told you the secret I've been carrying around. A social worker reads the notes, and then calls my sister, and that's where the story begins. My siblings weren't interested, really, except for my sister. And there was really nothing to be interested in, because if you remember what I said, the note said, I don't know what happened to her. So we kind of made, I wouldn't call it a conscious decision as much as a kind of unspoken decision that, well, there's no point in asking Mom about this if it's not going to go anywhere. So I never asked her.
And you were concerned about her health as well.
I was concerned about her health at the time, but she got better after that 1995 period. She lived until 1999. And, I gave her a chance. I would say, Mom, tell us again about how you're an only child. But she never took the bait. And so she died without revealing her secret directly to us. And then 6 months after she died, a letter that she was receiving annually from a cemetery arrived at my brother's house because the mail had been forwarded to him, and he calls me one day and says, who the heck is Annie? And so suddenly the secret had a name.
Right.
We didn't know her name in 1995. It still wasn't a book. It was curiosity. It was, I think I'll make a phone call to the state of Michigan while I'm trying to put out the Outlook section. And I was stumbling around not knowing what to ask, who to ask. But I thought I'd just try to find out some things. And without going into a long story, I got some records and I brought them to a family reunion. And that was the first time that the family kind of knew generally what had happened to Annie. But still, it wasn't a book. It wasn't even an idea for a book. And I'd love to say that I'm one of these inspired writers who just said, gotta tell that family story. But the truth is that an agent calls me in 2005, reading something I had read in the written in the Washington Post, and said, I really like what you write. Do you have any ideas for a book? I mean, she's basically doing a cold call, like a stockbroker, And that's how she got clients. And I said, well, I do have this kind of odd story that I wonder if it could be a book. And I had wondered. Let's have lunch and I'll tell you the story. And if I can't convince you to talk to the publishing world, then I probably can't convince the publishing world. And I'm fortunate to say that after half an hour, she looked at me and said, I got another half an hour, let's talk some more. Now that moment for me, I don't know how you have gone through that experience, that was great affirmation. Because you worry as a writer that, there have been some readers of this book that say, I don't care about your family. Now I see it as a universal story. I see my mother as any woman in her early 20s with a disabled sister, and I see Annie as any woman who was sent involuntarily to a Michigan mental hospital, and I see me as any son who's the recipient of this story. But I'd like to hear somebody else feel that way, and that was the agent, and that's what she did for me. She gave me the encouragement to think that I could write this. She said, now I've told that story in her presence, and she said, I don't remember the conversation that way at all. What I remember is I said to you, you got a lot of work to do, Buster.
And boy, was she right. And just so you know, if you're not in that writer's world or publishing world or agent's world, usually that conversation goes in the opposite direction. It's usually writers clamoring to an agent, writing them letters, knocking on their doors, and calling them and trying to get their attention. It's very rarely that the agent comes to the writer. So that's a great story.
As Woody Allen once said, 90% of life is just showing up. So.
Now, this is perhaps a bit of a writerly question, but a less confident writer, a less sure writer might have tried to string that up. That's the bombshell. You could have used that as the bombshell for the end. You could have led up to it. And yet you just deliver it right on page one. And I think that shows a confidence and an ability to tell the real story. And the real story was your process of discovery, not the secret itself. So was that a natural decision? Did it just happen that way?
It just didn't seem to me that there was any other way to begin. If you delay telling the secret, I think the reader's going to feel cheated. They're going to feel. But the other thing is that my agent also said to me, your secret's not that good. There are people with much more interesting secrets than that. So I'm kidding, but for me, every storyteller has to begin a story somewhere, but they rarely begin at the beginning. You usually begin with some sort of an emotion because you want to catch the reader's attention.
Right.
That's what I was doing, was beginning where, for me, the story began. And they began in the hospital, or not really in the hospital, but with the phone call to my sister when my mom was in the hospital. and that question. The social worker had been told by my mom, riding around with her in Detroit, all of these only child stories. And so she was confused. Now, we can have an interesting conversation about whether what the social worker did was a violation of confidentiality. I can tell you my answer, but that's an interesting question. But she didn't think about it that way. She thought about it as, if this is just a biographical fact, then why was I told something different? And, frankly, I think at the beginning for me, when I heard that my mom was 4 and that Annie was 2, I thought, well, you kind of are an only child, right? I mean, you don't grow up with your sister, she's been taken away, she's in some place, you don't know what happened to her. Of course, it was a lie.
Right.
My mom was 23 and Annie was 21.
Annie was only part of the secret.
Yeah.
Her name.
Yeah, and there were many secrets, as you know. And as a journalist, you learn quickly, by the time you've written your first dozen stories, that if someone isn't telling you the truth the first time out, they're probably not going to tell you the whole truth the second time out when you catch them in the lie. So I don't know why I thought what my mom was saying to the doctor was true, but I did. And it was because I was being a son.
Right.
Because mom told the truth.
Right.
Because I knew 3 things about my mom when I was growing up. Her name was Beth, she was an only child, and she always told me to tell the truth. Her name wasn't Beth. No. She wasn't an only child, and her relationship with the truth was, well, complicated.
Elastic. It's elastic.
Occasional handshakes with the truth.
Well, that decision to deliver that, to give us that secret right on the first page, turned out to be just a precursor of all of the other secrets that you uncovered. The existence of Nathan, for example, and what you just talked about, how she really did grow up with Annie. And also, some of your other relatives, as you go further afield, you learn that they too have very personal secrets. And so I guess as I'm reading it, I'm wondering, is this the Luxenberg family? Or is this a genetic trait? Or is this true of every family? I mean, are you a secretive person, Stephen?
I don't know, you tell me. The thing is that you guys know, how many people here have read Marty's book? Okay, so the people who have, you guys know a lot about us. We know nothing about you. And we're going to try to change that as the night goes on.
Right.
I wouldn't make the statement that every family has secrets. I think every family has a story. Every family has things that are peculiar to that family. I think that secrets, though, are much more common. And, I want to be clear. We don't need to live our lives as open books in which we blab everything what's happened to us to the rest of the world. That's a choice, not a fact. But I do think that secrets every generation creates new secrets because conditions change. Think of the 1980s, if you had a family member who was unfortunate enough to have AIDS. Now, they may have gotten AIDS through a blood transfusion, but the rest of the world knew mostly about drug abuse and homosexuality, and so some people hid that. I think that's very sad that they had to hide that at the moment when they need support, but they did. Well, that wasn't an issue in the 1940s because there was no AIDS then.
Right.
Then there will be new secrets created this year and in another generation. So, there can be good secrets. We would certainly agree that Anna hiding her Jewish identity in Ukraine was probably a good secret because it helped her to survive.
Yes.
So when is the secret a bad secret? That's a fascinating conversation.
I think so, and there is, I believe it was historian Debora Cohen, one of the many people that helped you uncover your documents. And I actually wanted to just read what she said because she was so astute, I thought, about the existence of secrets and how you handle. She's
a professor at Northwestern now, then at Brown University.
And a historian, you call her. She writes, or Stephen quotes her as in his book, as a historian, she says, I think secrets shouldn't be allowed to survive the people who kept them. As a historian, I see nothing wrong at all with the notion of revealing. But you come along with a particular stake, and that's the complicated part to me. Why is it that we have a compulsion to reveal? Shouldn't some things be allowed to be secrets? What's the relationship between secrecy and the ability to keep secrets and the integrity of the family? What a deep thinker.
Yeah, she's just written a book about family secrets. I'm speaking with her next week in Chicago.
Oh, well, good.
And I'm really worried about it because she is more articulate than I am.
Very articulate in that part. But what do you think about that statement? I think secrets shouldn't be allowed to survive the people who kept them.
Well, let's define secrecy for a minute, because just because you don't talk about something doesn't make it a secret.
Mm-hmm.
If you and I know something, and I'm not burdened by the knowledge that I have, then I would say it's not a secret.
Right.
It's just something we're not talking about, or we're not sharing with the rest of the world. A secret is something that only you know. And if somebody ever says to you, "Can I tell you a secret?" you probably should say no.
I couldn't
Because
say
no, because journalists, we never can say no. But you know, if the person is telling it to you, your impulse is, of course, not want to have that burden. You want to, not share that problem. But of course, if it's a friend and a confidant, you might say yes. I think that in the mental health field in particular, any of you have tried to get records in the state of Michigan, which is not among the worst states on this issue, but it's very difficult for a family member to unearth your own family's history. Now, we have exalted and advanced privacy as perhaps one of the most important rights in our country. But Hegel, who I'm not used to quoting, German philosophers, once said that a tragedy is not the conflict between right and wrong, it's the conflict between two rights. That's the real tragedy. We also have a right to know, and especially as we learn more and more about genetics and the basis for physical and perhaps mental health, although a lot of mental health is not a genetic thing. You want to know about your family's medical records, but good luck trying to get them. Why have we sealed, which they are, the records of people who are 100 years old who were in a mental institution? What is the harm in revealing that? I can tell you the harm in keeping it secret. It perpetuates the stigma that it's a shame to have a mental illness. That's the harm. I have yet to hear a good answer to what the benefit is. Now, if you, or any of you, don't want anybody to read your records after you die, we have a way of dealing with that. You can leave a letter saying, "I don't agree." I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just saying it shouldn't be a default that you would have wanted your records kept secret. Why do we do that? Census records are open 72 years. That's what the government, the Congress decided after they've been collected. So there are ways to deal with the competing rights that exist. And I think it's wrong to keep those records secret.
For the people who didn't read the book, and maybe to refresh the memory of those of us who have, describe what you had to go through in order to get the court's permission to look at some of these records.
Well, very briefly, because you don't want to, and I want to give away the whole book. So in Michigan, you can always file a lawsuit. A judge can always sign a court order. But how much do you want to go put yourself out going, if you don't hire a lawyer, you're doing it yourself. Maybe you don't live out of state, you have to come back for court hearings. Lawsuits are a complicated process. And I didn't want to do that. And I went to the Wayne County Probate Court because, and I'm giving you guys a tip, court records, by and large, are open. It doesn't matter if medical records are in them. They're court records. The fact that they're medical records is inadvertent. So if you want to find out something about a family member, head to the court first because you're likely to be satisfied. Now that won't tell you the story. That won't tell you the whole story. But I went to the Wayne County Probate Court, and it's a scene in the book in which I tell you how I first got Annie's court records. Now, why was she on a court record? Because she was involuntarily committed to the institution. So there had to be a legal proceeding to presumably have an adversarial process to see whether she should belong there. Wasn't very adversarial, but that's a whole other story. But then I wanted to get the hospital records. And one option that was offered to me by someone who worked at the probate court, because I was kind of interviewing them about the system, and I think that's the mistake a lot of people make, is that you can't understand the system until you understand what the system sees as the law. And what this woman said was, well, you could open an estate in your mother's name if you got your siblings' permission. And then once you were your mother's representative, you could, acting as her, open an estate in Annie's name because your mother was the heir to Annie.